I was folding laundry in my bedroom when my phone rang. The number was local but unfamiliar. Something in my gut told me to answer. A professional woman's voice on the other end asked if I was speaking with Patricia Chen, I confirmed, feeling my chest tighten for reasons I couldn't explain. The woman introduced herself as Detective Rebecca Morris from the Fraud Division of the County Sheriff's Department. She needed to speak with me about some financial irregularities that had been flagged in my name. My hands immediately went cold. Detective Morris asked if I could come to the station that afternoon. She couldn't discuss details over the phone, but it was urgent. I agreed, hung up, and stared at my reflection in the bedroom mirror. At 67 years old, I had lived a careful, honest life. I paid my taxes on time. I never even got parking tickets. What could possibly require a detective's attention? I drove to the station with my heart pounding. The waiting area smelled like stale coffee and cleaning products. After 20 minutes, Detective Morris called me into a small interview room. She was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through me. She asked me to sit down and then slid a folder across the table. Inside were bank statements, loan applications, and property transfer documents. All had my name on them. All had signatures that looked like mine. But I had never seen any of these papers in my life. Detective Morris watched my face as I flipped through page after page, my confusion growing into something closer to terror. She explained that her department had been investigating a real estate fraud ring. During their investigation, they discovered multiple properties had been purchased, refinanced, and sold using my identity. The total amount involved was close to $340,000. My mouth went dry. I could barely form words. I told her I knew nothing about any of this, that someone must have stolen my identity. Detective Morris nodded slowly. She said that's what they initially thought, too. But then they pulled security footage from the banks and title companies. She turned her laptop toward me and pressed play. The video showed a woman walking into a bank, sitting down with a loan officer, signing documents, and walking out with a cashier's check. The woman was my daughter, Caroline. I felt the room spin. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. Detective Morris paused the video and asked if I recognized the woman. My voice came out as barely a whisper when I confirmed it was my daughter. She asked if I'd given Caroline permission to act on my behalf for any financial transactions. I shook my head, still unable to process what I was seeing. The detective showed me more videos. Caroline at different banks. Caroline at title companies. Caroline signing my name over and over, always with that same confident smile, always perfectly dressed in business attire, always looking like she belonged there. In one video, she had brought my actual driver's license and passport. I realized with horror that she must have taken them from my house during one of her frequent visits. Detective Morris explained they had identified at least 7 fraudulent transactions. Caroline had taken out mortgages on properties using my name and credit, then either refinanced them immediately to pull out cash or sold them and pocketed the proceeds. She had created an intricate web of lies using fake rental agreements, fabricated financial statements, and forged documents to make everything appear legitimate. I asked with a shaking voice how this was possible. How had no one caught this? Detective Morris sighed. She explained that Caroline had been careful. She targeted small banks and credit unions. She spread the transactions across different counties. She used my excellent credit score and clean financial history to her advantage. By the time red flags started appearing, she had already moved the money through multiple accounts and disappeared with most of it. The detective asked if I had noticed anything suspicious in recent months. Suddenly, fragments of memory clicked into place. Caroline had been visiting more frequently over the past year, always asking to use my computer, always offering to help me organize my paperwork. She had convinced me to give her copies of my identification documents, claiming she needed them to add me to her health insurance plan at work. She had borrowed my laptop multiple times, saying hers was broken. I had trusted her completely. She was my daughter, my only child. The baby I raised alone after my husband died when she was just 3 years old. The little girl I worked 3 jobs to put through college. The woman I bragged about to all my friends, so proud of her successful real estate career. And all along, she had been systematically destroying me. Detective Morris gave me a moment to collect myself. Then she asked the hardest question. She asked if I wanted to press charges. She explained that without my formal complaint, they couldn't move forward with prosecution. But if I did file charges, Caroline would be arrested and would likely face significant prison time. I sat in that cold interview room, staring at freeze frames of my daughter's face on the computer screen, and felt my entire world crumbling. How does a mother make a decision like that? How do you choose between protecting yourself and destroying your own child? But even as those thoughts swirled in my mind, I knew there was no real choice. What Caroline had done was beyond family conflict. It was criminal. It was calculated. It was cruel. I told Detective Morris I needed to understand the full extent of what had happened before I made any decisions. She nodded and said that was fair. She gave me copies of everything they had compiled and told me to review it carefully. She scheduled another meeting for 3 days later. As I walked out of the station clutching that folder, I felt like I was carrying evidence of my own death. I drove home in a daze. I pulled into my driveway and sat in my car for almost an hour, unable to move. My small house, the one I had scrimped and saved to buy 30 years ago, suddenly felt like a crime scene. Caroline had walked through that front door hundreds of times. She had sat at my kitchen table. She had hugged me in my living room. And all the while, she had been planning how to rob me of everything. That night, I spread all the documents across my dining room table. I put on my reading glasses and began going through every page, every statement, every fraudulent signature. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. It wasn't just a few bad decisions or a moment of weakness. This was a sophisticated, long-term scheme that had required planning, patience, and a complete absence of conscience. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Caroline's face on those security videos, signing my name with such casual confidence. At dawn, I gave up trying to sleep and returned to the dining room table. I needed to understand everything. I needed to know exactly how my daughter had destroyed me. The first property transaction had occurred 18 months ago. Caroline had used my identity to purchase a small rental house in a neighboring county for $180,000. She put down 20% using a personal loan she had taken out in my name from an online lender. Then she immediately took out a mortgage for the remaining $144,000. The property never had any real tenants. Within 6 months, she sold it for $195,000 and pocketed the profit plus the borrowed down payment. The second transaction was even more audacious. She purchased a duplex for $220,000, again using my identity and credit. This time, she claimed I would be living in one unit and renting out the other. The bank approved the loan based on projected rental income that never existed. 3 months later, she refinanced the property, pulling out an additional $40,000 in cash. Then she stopped making payments and let it go into foreclosure. I felt sick reading through each transaction. Property after property, loan after loan. Each one carefully structured to extract maximum cash while leaving me holding the debt. The paperwork showed she had created fake tax returns in my name, showing income I never earned. She had forged employment letters claiming I worked for companies I had never heard of. She had even created fake rental agreements with fictitious tenants. My phone rang, interrupting my research. It was my best friend, Helen, calling to check in. She could immediately tell something was wrong from my voice. Helen had been my friend for over 30 years. She knew Caroline since she was a baby. I told her everything, and she listened in stunned silence. When I finished, she started crying. She said she had to tell me something she had kept secret for months. Helen confessed that Caroline had approached her 6 months ago, asking to borrow $15,000. She claimed she was investing in a real estate opportunity and would pay Helen back with interest within 60 days. Helen, trusting Caroline because she was my daughter, had given her the money, but Caroline never paid her back. Every time Helen asked about it, Caroline had excuses. Eventually, Helen stopped asking because she didn't want to damage our friendship. I felt a new wave of rage wash over me. It wasn't enough that Caroline had stolen from me. She had also stolen from my best friend, from someone who trusted her because of me. I asked Helen if she had any documentation of the loan. She said yes, Caroline had signed a promissory note. I told Helen everything about the criminal investigation and asked if she would be willing to file her own complaint. She agreed immediately. Over the next 2 days, I became obsessed with investigation. I started pulling my credit reports from all 3 major bureaus. What I found was devastating. My credit score had dropped from 810 to 490. There were multiple late payment notices. Several accounts had gone to collections. There were inquiries from dozens of lenders I had never contacted. My perfect credit history, built over 40 years of responsible financial behavior, had been demolished. I called every creditor listed on the reports. Most were sympathetic, but explained they couldn't discuss the accounts without going through formal fraud procedures. I filed fraud reports with each one, providing them with the detective's contact information. The process was exhausting and humiliating. Having to explain over and over that my own daughter had done this to me felt like being forced to relive the betrayal repeatedly. I also started going through my own financial records more carefully. I discovered that Caroline had been stealing from me in smaller ways for years. She had access to my online banking because she had helped me set it up, claiming it was for my own convenience so she could help me pay bills if I was ever sick. I found transfers from my savings account to accounts I didn't recognize, usually $200 or $300 at a time, amounts small enough that I hadn't noticed them missing. I added them up. Over 3 years, she had transferred $18,000 from my savings account, money I had saved for emergencies, for medical expenses, for my burial fund, so I wouldn't be a burden to anyone. She had drained it slowly, like a vampire feeding just enough to survive, but not enough to kill the host, at least not immediately. I also discovered she had added herself as a joint owner on my checking account without my knowledge. She must have forged my signature on the bank's authorization form. This meant she had legal access to every penny in that account. I checked the balance and felt my blood run cold. I had $2,147 in checking. I should have had over $12,000. She had been withdrawing cash regularly, usually $500 at a time, always at ATMs far from my neighborhood. I immediately went to my bank and demanded to speak with the manager. I brought all the documentation from Detective Morris. The manager, a kind man named Patricia Chen, listened to my story with growing concern. He pulled up my account history and confirmed what I had discovered. He was horrified that this had happened to one of their longtime customers. Robert explained the process for disputing the fraudulent transactions. However, he warned me that because Caroline was listed as a joint account holder, it would be difficult to prove the withdrawals were unauthorized. The bank's position would be that she had legitimate access. My best chance was through the criminal case. If Caroline was convicted of fraud, the bank would work with me to recover what was stolen. I closed that checking account immediately and opened a new one with only my name. I changed all my passwords. I put fraud alerts on all my credit files. I felt like I was in witness protection, hiding from my own daughter. Robert also suggested I get a safe deposit box for my important documents. I couldn't keep anything in my house anymore. It wasn't safe. My own home wasn't safe because of my own child. That night, I tried calling Caroline. I had been avoiding it, too afraid of what I might say, too afraid of what she might say. But I needed to hear her voice. I needed to give her a chance to explain, even though I knew there could be no explanation good enough. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I tried 3 more times over the next hour. Each time, voicemail. She was screening my calls. Or maybe Detective Morris had already contacted her, and she knew I knew. Maybe she was already running, already planning her escape, already moving to her next victim. Unable to reach Caroline by phone, I decided to go to her apartment. It was a 30-minute drive across town. She lived in a modern building, the kind with a doorman and secured parking. I had always been so proud that she could afford such a nice place. Now I realized her nice apartment was probably paid for with my stolen money. The doorman recognized me from previous visits and let me into the building. I took the elevator to the 8th floor, my heart pounding with each ascending number. I stood outside her door for a full minute, trying to find the courage to knock. Finally, I did. 3 firm knocks. I heard movement inside. Then silence. I knocked again. "Caroline, I know you're in there. We need to talk." More silence. Then the door opened, but only a few inches, held by the security chain. Caroline's face appeared in the gap. She looked tired, her hair uncombed, her eyes red. For a moment, I saw my little girl, and my heart softened. But then I remembered why I was there. "Mom, this isn't a good time," she said, her voice flat. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything she had done, she was going to try to turn me away at the door like an unwanted salesperson. I told her firmly that she would make time, that I knew everything, that I had been to the police, that she needed to explain herself right now. Something flickered across her face. Not shame or remorse. It looked more like calculation. She closed the door to remove the chain, then opened it fully and stepped aside to let me in. Her apartment was a mess. Expensive furniture, but clothes everywhere, dishes in the sink, papers scattered across the coffee table. This wasn't the organized, put-together daughter I thought I knew. I walked into her living room and turned to face her. I asked her directly if she had been using my identity to commit fraud. She didn't even try to deny it. She just shrugged and said, "So you found out." Those 4 words, delivered with such casual indifference, hit me harder than any confession could have. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't even surprised. She had always known this day might come and had simply decided not to care. I felt tears starting to form, but I forced them back. I asked her how she could do this to me, how she could steal from the mother who gave her everything, who sacrificed everything for her future. Caroline laughed. It was a bitter, ugly sound. She said that was exactly the problem, that I had given her everything, that I had always controlled everything in her life, that she was just taking what should have been hers anyway. I was stunned into silence. This narrative she had created, where somehow I was the villain and she was the victim, was so disconnected from reality I didn't know how to respond. I reminded her that I worked myself to exhaustion to give her opportunities, that I paid for her education, that I helped her when she couldn't find a job after college, that every sacrifice I made was out of love. Caroline's face hardened. She told me that was the problem, that I had held those sacrifices over her head her entire life, that every time she tried to be independent, I reminded her of everything I had done, that she was tired of owing me, tired of being grateful, tired of being the dutiful daughter. So she decided to just take what she wanted and be done with it. Her words were like physical blows. I had never held my sacrifices over her head. I had never asked for gratitude beyond basic respect and love. I had simply been her mother, doing what mothers do. But she had twisted it all in her mind, creating a justification for theft, for betrayal, for the complete destruction of my financial life. I asked her about the money. What had she done with hundreds of thousands of dollars? She gestured vaguely around the apartment. This, travel, investments that didn't pan out, living my life without asking permission. I looked around at her expensive furniture, Her designer clothes draped over chairs, her high-end electronics, all of it purchased with money stolen from me while I clipped coupons and worried about medical bills. I told her the police knew everything, that I had seen the security videos, that she was going to be arrested. I expected fear, panic, maybe even then some remorse. Instead, she smiled. She said she had already talked to a lawyer, that most of the money was gone, spent or hidden where no one could trace it, that even if she went to prison, which she doubted because white-collar criminals rarely did, I would never recover most of what she took, that in the end, she had won. Something inside me broke in that moment, not my spirit, but my last remaining attachment to the daughter I thought I had raised. The woman standing in front of me was a stranger, a criminal, a sociopath who could casually discuss destroying her mother's life as if it were a successful business transaction. I realized there was no reaching her, no making her understand, no path to reconciliation or healing. I told her I would be pressing full charges, that I hoped she went to prison, that she was no longer my daughter. She laughed again and told me to do my worst. As I turned to leave, she called out one more thing. She said I should have just given her the money when she asked for it years ago, that if I had been a better mother, a more generous mother, she wouldn't have had to take these measures. She was still blaming me for her crimes, even as she confessed to them. I walked out of that apartment and didn't look back. I made it to my car before the tears came. I sobbed in the parking lot for 20 minutes, mourning not my daughter, but the idea of my daughter. The person I thought she was had never existed. I had been loving a fiction, a mask she wore to hide her true nature. The next day, I met with Detective Morris again as scheduled. This time, I brought Helen with me. We both filed formal complaints. Helen provided her promissory note showing the $15,000 Caroline had borrowed and never repaid. Detective Morris explained this helped establish a pattern of fraud that extended beyond just identity theft. The detective told us that Caroline had indeed contacted a lawyer, a man named Gerald Sutton, who specialized in white-collar criminal defense. Sutton had already sent a letter to the prosecutor's office claiming Caroline had verbal authorization from me for all the transactions, that this was a family financial matter, not criminal fraud. It was an absurd claim, but it would complicate the case. Detective Morris asked if I had any documentation that might prove I never authorized Caroline's actions. I thought hard about this. Then I remembered something. For the past 5 years, I had been keeping a detailed journal. Nothing fancy, just a simple diary where I wrote about my daily life, my thoughts, my activities. I rushed home and brought back every journal. We went through them systematically. In the journals, I had written about my financial concerns, my careful budgeting, my pride in my clean credit. I had also written about Caroline's visits, noting dates and what we discussed. There was no mention anywhere of real estate investments, property purchases, or giving her permission for anything. If anything, my journal entries showed I was completely unaware of what she was doing. More importantly, during the time period when the fraudulent transactions occurred, I had written extensively about financial stress, about cutting back on expenses, about worrying whether I could afford new glasses, about skipping meals to save money. If I had actually been investing in real estate and making large transactions, this made no sense. The journals provided a contemporaneous record that contradicted Caroline's claim of authorization. Detective Morris was pleased. This was solid evidence. She made copies of relevant pages and added them to the case file. She explained the next steps. The district attorney's office would review everything and decide whether to file criminal charges. Given the amount of money involved and the clear evidence, she was confident they would proceed. Meanwhile, I had my own work to do. I hired a a woman named Sandra Hoffman who specialized in identity theft and financial fraud cases. Sandra was in her 50s, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense. She reviewed everything and gave me a realistic assessment. She said the criminal case looked strong, but recovering the money would be challenging. Sandra explained that even if Caroline was convicted, there was no guarantee I would get my money back. Much of it was already spent or hidden. We could pursue civil judgments, but you can't squeeze blood from a stone. However, Sandra said we should file a civil lawsuit anyway, both to create pressure and to establish legal documentation of the debt. We filed the civil suit within a week. We sued Caroline for fraud, conversion, breach of fiduciary duty, and emotional distress. We asked for actual damages of $340,000 plus punitive damages of an additional $1 million. Sandra explained the punitive damages were unlikely to be awarded, but asking for them sent a message about the severity of what Caroline had done. Caroline was served with the lawsuit at her apartment. Her lawyer, Gerald Sutton, responded with a motion to dismiss, again claiming this was a family matter that should be handled privately, not in court. The judge denied the motion. Sutton then filed a counterclaim alleging that I actually owed Caroline money for years of caregiving services she had provided me. It was another lie, another desperate tactic. Sandra was unfazed. She said these kinds of counterclaims were common in family fraud cases. The perpetrator tries to muddy the waters, create the appearance of a complex family dispute rather than clear-cut theft. But the evidence would speak for itself. We just had to stay focused and not get distracted by Caroline's lies. Around this time, I started receiving phone calls from other members of Caroline's life. Her ex-boyfriend Ryan called me, asking if I knew where she was. He said Caroline had borrowed $8,000 from him 6 months ago to pay for what she claimed was my emergency medical procedure. He had just realized I had never been sick. He wanted his money back. Caroline's former roommate Jennifer also contacted me. She said Caroline had stolen her identity too, opening credit cards and taking out small loans in Jennifer's name. Jennifer had filed a police report, but had been told there wasn't enough evidence to pursue charges. Hearing about my case, she wanted to join it, hoping that a pattern of behavior would make the authorities take her complaint more seriously. Each new revelation was like another wound. Caroline hadn't just destroyed me. She was a predator who had victimized multiple people, including those who trusted her, who cared about her, who wanted to help her. It was a pattern of behavior going back years. I had been just the biggest target, the one with the most to steal. I coordinated with Ryan and Jennifer, putting them in touch with Detective Morris. Their reports were added to the expanding case file. The prosecutor, a stern woman named District Attorney Margaret Walsh, told me she was now looking at charging Caroline with multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. The potential prison time had increased significantly. 6 weeks after my initial meeting with Detective Morris, I got the call I had been waiting for and dreading. Caroline had been arrested. She had been taken into custody at her apartment early that morning. Her bail was set at $200,000. Given that she had already demonstrated a willingness to commit financial fraud and had access to large amounts of stolen money, the judge considered her a flight risk. I felt a complex swirl of emotions, relief that she was in custody, sadness that it had come to this, anger that she had forced me to take these steps, and underneath it all, a mother's persistent pain at seeing her child suffer, even when that suffering was deserved, even when that child had tried to destroy her. Gerald Sutton posted Caroline's bail using a bondsman. She was released within 24 hours. The conditions of her bail included surrendering her passport, wearing an ankle monitor, and having no contact with me or any other witnesses in the case. She was also prohibited from accessing any financial accounts or conducting any business without prior court approval. The arraignment was scheduled for the following week. I attended with Sandra. It was the first time I had seen Caroline since our confrontation in her apartment. She looked different, thinner. Her hair was pulled back severely. She wore a plain gray suit that made her look older. When she saw me in the courtroom, her expression didn't change. No acknowledgement, no emotion, just a blank stare, as if I were a stranger. The judge read the charges: 7 counts of identity theft, 5 counts of grand larceny, 3 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of mortgage fraud, multiple counts of forgery. Each charge carried potential prison time. Combined, Caroline was looking at up to 40 years. Gerald Sutton entered a plea of not guilty on her behalf. The prosecutor, D.A. Walsh, presented a summary of the evidence: the security videos, the forged documents, the financial records, my journal entries, the testimonies from Ryan and Jennifer. It was overwhelming. Even the judge looked disturbed as he listened. He asked Sutton if he wanted to reconsider the plea. Sutton declined, stating they would vigorously defend against these charges. As we left the courthouse, a young woman approached me in the hallway. She introduced herself as a reporter from the local newspaper. She had been in the courtroom and wanted to interview me about the case. I hesitated, but Sandra encouraged me. She said public awareness of elder financial abuse was important, that telling my story might help others recognize the warning signs and seek help. I agreed to the interview. We met at a coffee shop the next day. The reporter, whose name was Amy Chen, was professional and compassionate. I told her everything, holding back only a few private details. She recorded our conversation and took notes. She said the article would run in the Sunday edition, giving it maximum visibility. When the article appeared, the response was overwhelming. My phone rang constantly. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years called to offer support. Neighbors stopped by with food and flowers. But there were also difficult calls. Some family members accused me of being vindictive, of destroying Caroline's life over money, of failing to show maternal forgiveness. One particularly painful call came from my sister Linda, who lived across the country. She told me I was being selfish, that family should always forgive family, that I was choosing money over my daughter. I tried to explain that this wasn't about money, it was about being systematically defrauded by someone I trusted completely. Linda wouldn't hear it. She said I had always been too hard on Caroline, too controlling, and this was the result. The accusation stung because it echoed Caroline's own words. Had I been too controlling? Had I somehow driven her to this? I spent sleepless nights questioning myself, reviewing my parenting, trying to find where I had gone wrong. Sandra noticed my emotional state during one of our meetings and firmly set me straight. She told me what Caroline did was not a result of bad parenting or being too controlling. It was calculated criminal behavior that Caroline had chosen freely. Plenty of people had difficult relationships with their parents and didn't resort to massive fraud. I needed to stop accepting false guilt for Caroline's choices. She was an adult who knew right from wrong and chose wrong anyway. Helen and several other friends organized a support group for me. We met weekly at Helen's house. Some of them had also experienced betrayal by family members, though none quite as severe as mine. Sharing our stories, supporting each other, and having a safe space to express our pain and anger was healing. I wasn't alone in this nightmare. During this time, the legal machinery ground forward. Discovery proceeded, with both sides exchanging documents and evidence. Depositions were scheduled. Expert witnesses were hired to analyze the forged signatures and fraudulent documents. Every step was documented, recorded, and added to the growing mountain of paperwork. Sandra received Caroline's deposition transcript and called me immediately. She said I needed to read it. Caroline had stuck to her story that I had given verbal authorization for everything. But under oath and detailed questioning, her story fell apart. She couldn't explain why there was no paper trail of our supposed agreements. She couldn't explain my journal entries expressing financial stress. She couldn't explain the letters she had forged in my name. Most damningly, when asked directly, "Did you ever explicitly tell your mother you were taking out loans in her name?" Caroline had answered, "No, but she knew I was managing her affairs." When pressed on what she meant by managing affairs, she became evasive and contradictory. The deposition was a disaster for her defense. The trial was scheduled for late November, about 8 months after Caroline's initial arrest. Those months were a blur of meetings, preparations, and emotional turmoil. Sandra prepared me extensively for my testimony. We went over every document, every transaction, every journal entry. She coached me on staying calm, speaking clearly, and not letting Caroline's lawyer rattle me. The prosecution called me as their first witness. I walked into that courtroom with my head high, despite my shaking hands. I was sworn in and took the stand. D.A. Walsh led me through my testimony. She asked about my relationship with Caroline, about my financial history, about my discovery of the fraud. I told my story clearly and honestly. When it came time for cross-examination, Gerald Sutton tried every trick in the book. He suggested I was a controlling mother who had driven Caroline to desperation. He implied my memory was faulty due to my age. He tried to twist my words, to create confusion about dates and details. But I held firm. I had the truth on my side, and I knew it. Sutton's most aggressive line of questioning came when he asked if I had ever told Caroline she could handle my financial affairs. I explained that yes, I had given her access to my online banking to help pay bills if I was sick. But that was completely different from authorizing fraudulent real estate transactions. He tried to blur that distinction, but the jury's expressions showed they understood the difference. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented the security videos showing Caroline at banks and title companies. They brought in handwriting experts who testified the signatures on the fraudulent documents were forged. They presented bank records showing the flow of money from my accounts to Caroline's. They showed my credit reports, documenting the destruction of my financial reputation. Ryan and Jennifer both testified about Caroline defrauding them as well, establishing a pattern of behavior. The prosecutor brought in a financial forensic expert who traced every dollar Caroline had stolen and where it went. Expensive vacations, luxury goods, designer clothes, high-end restaurants. She had spent my money living a lifestyle she couldn't afford while I ate rice and beans. The defense's case was weak. Sutton tried to paint Caroline as a loving daughter who had made some poor judgment calls, but had no criminal intent. He called character witnesses who testified about Caroline's good qualities and community involvement. But it all felt hollow against the mountain of evidence showing calculated, sustained fraud. Caroline herself took the stand in her own defense. It was the first time I had heard her speak at length since our confrontation. She stuck to her story that she believed she had authorization, that it was all a misunderstanding, that she never intended to harm me. She even cried at one point, saying how much she loved me and how sorry she was that things had gotten so confused. But during cross-examination, D.A. Walsh systematically destroyed her testimony. She presented Caroline with her own deposition, pointing out contradictions between what she said then and what she was saying now. She asked Caroline to explain specific transactions, specific forged documents, specific lies. Caroline became flustered, her answers increasingly evasive and illogical. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Finally, it was time for closing arguments. D.A. Walsh gave a powerful summary of the evidence, painting Caroline as a calculating criminal who had systematically exploited her mother's trust. She asked the jury to send a message that elder financial abuse would not be tolerated, that family relationships did not provide a license to steal. Sutton's closing argument asked for mercy. He portrayed Caroline as someone who had made mistakes but didn't deserve to have her life destroyed. He emphasized my age and suggested I was confused about many details, that this was genuinely a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by overzealous prosecutors. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Those 48 hours were agony. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I paced my house, jumped at every phone call, replayed every moment of the trial in my mind. Helen stayed with me, providing constant support and reassurance. Finally, the call came. The jury had reached a verdict. We rushed to the courthouse. The courtroom was packed. I sat in the front row with Sandra on one side and Helen on the other. Caroline sat at the defense table, her face pale and drawn. The jury filed in, none of them looking at Caroline. Sandra squeezed my hand and whispered that was a good sign. The judge asked the jury foreman if they had reached a verdict. He said yes. The clerk read the verdicts aloud. Guilty, 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 on every single count. I heard gasps from Caroline's side of the courtroom. I saw her shoulders slump. Gerald Sutton put his hand on her arm. I felt tears streaming down my face, though I wasn't sure if they were tears of relief, sadness, or something else entirely. The judge thanked the jury and dismissed them. He set a sentencing date for 6 weeks later. Caroline was remanded back into custody immediately, her bail revoked now that she had been convicted. As the bailiff led her away in handcuffs, she looked back at me once. Our eyes met for just a moment. I still saw no remorse there, just defeat. The 6 weeks before sentencing passed slowly. I tried to return to some semblance of normal life, but it was impossible. The trial had been covered extensively in local media. Everywhere I went, people recognized me. Some offered support and congratulations. Others gave me strange looks, as if I were somehow suspect for having prosecuted my own daughter. Sandra helped me prepare a victim impact statement to read at sentencing. Writing it was one of the hardest things I had ever done. How do you summarize the devastation of being betrayed by your child? How do you put into words the loss of trust, the financial ruin, the emotional destruction? I wrote and rewrote it a dozen times. The sentencing hearing was shorter than the trial, but no less intense. The courtroom was again filled with people. D.A. Walsh presented sentencing recommendations, asking for significant prison time given the scope and calculated nature of Caroline's crimes. She emphasized that Caroline had shown no remorse, had continued lying throughout the legal process, and represented an ongoing danger to others, if not incarcerated. Then it was my turn to read my victim impact statement. I walked to the podium with shaking hands and read what I had written. Your Honor, my name is Patricia Chen.